Hello and welcome to another round of agri-history. Today we will talk about the Rubus genus, its natural history, and its domestication. Within this genus there are 12 subgenera, but we will only talk about 2. The first will be Adiobactis, which include raspberries, and Eubactis, which includes all blackberries. First, we'll cover raspberries. The common red raspberry is known as Rubus idaeus. This species is found in Asia, Europe, and North America. This species can be divided into 2 subspecies: the European subspecies and North American subspecies. The European subspecies is found in Asia Minor and Europe. The North American subspecies is found in East Asia and North America. Both subspecies can crossbreed with no problem, and little to no sterility. Now let's talk about the difference between the domesticated forms of red raspberry versus the domesticated forms of blackberry, for comparison's sake. Domesticated forms of blackberry are almost identical to their wild counterparts. In red raspberries, there's many differences between the wild and domesticated forms of raspberry. The wild red raspberry has 70 canes per plant, but can have a range between 30 to 100 canes. The canes on the wild raspberry are thinner than the domesticated raspberry. The wild red raspberry has small fruit with crumbly textures, and these fruit tend to be hidden within the canes themselves. Domesticated red raspberry, on the other hand, has less than 20 canes per plant, thicker canes, larger and firmer fruit. Now let's talk about the history of red raspberries. The first mention of the red raspberry species was found in the pre-Christian writer Cato. However, Pliny the Elder mentioned a type of fruit called the Ida fruit, which has the same description as the common red raspberry. This fruit was named after the people of Mount Ida who consumed them. It is also the reference we get the name Rubus idaeus from. Since these fruit were never mentioned by important writers at the time, it is unlikely that this fruit was noteworthy as a food source during that time period. The famous writer of that time, Dioscorus, only wrote about these species in the medical sense, since the flowers were used to make stomach potions and eye drops. But by the 4th century, Palladius, a Roman agricultural writer, wrote about raspberries as a cultivated plant, and raspberry seeds have been found in Roman forts in Britain. Although Mount Ida is the inspiration for the scientific name of this species, modern botanists have not been able to find the center of origin for the species. This has led some to suggest that the Ide Mountains in Turkey might be a better candidate. The next noteworthy appearance in literature of the red raspberry was that the clerks of King Henry III brought red raspberry to flavor his drinks. But nothing else known was written until the 16th century. During the 16th century, Macaulay wrote that in Bohemia, the species was being moved from the forests into gardens. Later, Rulius wrote that raspberries were widely grown in gardens. Yellow varieties of raspberry were recorded by Jennings in 1588 and by Clusius in 1601. Raspberries were also mentioned in Germanic herbal literature during that century. It was also mentioned in William Turner's book on herbs, written in 1548, although a book written by Heersbach in 1570 seemed to indicate that raspberries were not popular yet. However, John Parkinson wrote in his book Paradisi in Seoul in 1629 that red, white, and thornless raspberries were making an appearance. A plant catalog by a company called Tradescant mentioned 4 cultivars of raspberry in 1656, one of which was called Purpureo, possibly because it had a darker color. In 1629, Werlich gave a record of the first raspberry with larger fruit. This indicates selection for better quality fruit. In 1780, Richard Weston gave the first recording of a twice-bearing raspberry cultivar. In 1829, the book History of English Gardening mentioned 23 raspberry cultivars. And in 1832, 20 American cultivars of raspberry were mentioned. This evidence seemed to indicate that domestication happened 400 to 500 years ago. Now on to the breeding history of red raspberry cultivars. We'll start in Britain. Britain, during the 19th and 20th century, marked a heyday for raspberry breeding. During this time, multiple gardeners and nurserymen took up plant breeding and produced many cultivars of high quality. The best cultivar of that beginning period was called Red Antwerp. This cultivar was notable for its large fruit. The other cultivars of renown were Falstaff and Superlative. John Bomthorpe bred his famous cultivar, Bomthorpe, from the latter cultivar. The eponymous Laxton Nursery produced many cultivars such as Bountiful, Prolific, Renown, Reward, and Yellowhammer. But the most successful raspberry breeder at the time was T.B. Pine of Topsham Nursery. He bred many varieties including Devon, Red Cross, Park Lane, and its descendant Mayfair. His most famous cultivar was called Royal, however. Another breeder known as J.J. Kettle bred the variety Lloyd George. This cultivar rivaled Royal in quality, and both cultivars were used extensively in breeding. Another important cultivar was called Norfolk Giant. Norfolk Giant was a raspberry cultivar found as a chance seedling in Norfolk. Up until that time, most raspberry cultivars were made through chance selections, or open pollinated seedlings. The first practice with controlled breeding happened under the Research Institute Mulane Research Station. This breeding program was supervised by Dr. Grubb. He and his colleagues evaluated all the strains of raspberry available at that time, ranking them from best to worst. The traits of interest for future raspberry breeding at that time were better shipping traits, alongside early season and late season raspberries. Late season raspberries were desired by strawberry growers due to the early season nature of strawberries at that time. So late season raspberries could be a way of easing the transition from strawberries to raspberries within a farm. For the early season varieties, Dr. Grubb used the cultivar Lloyd George to add a shipping trait, and the earliness needed to breed new early season cultivars, while Norfolk Giant was also used to add aphid resistance. for the use of these cultivars: Dr. Grub bred Mulling Promise, Mulling Exploit, and Mulling Jewel. Now let's talk about North American breeds of raspberry. Earliest form of American red raspberries were European in nature, but by 1806 there were 20 cultivars mentioned in the Pomological Manual. 16 were probably of pure-blooded European origin. One was a hybrid of North American and European raspberries, and 3 were of pure-blooded American red raspberry origin. 3 pure-blooded American red raspberry cultivars were called Stover, Brandywine, and Turner. As time went on, controlled crossbreeding of wild and European red raspberries took off, leading to many new cultivars like Lapham and Chief. Now we'll go further into the crossbreeding between American and European red raspberry subspecies. For crossbreeding, the American cultivars used were mostly Brinkles Orange and Cuthbert. The latter was a hybrid between both subspecies. The European cultivars used most were Superlative, Marlborough, and Lloyd George. Lloyd George especially was extensively used in crossbreeding for further cultivar production. 32% of the North American cultivars of that time have Lloyd George as one of their parents. 37% are distantly related to Lloyd George, with only 31% having no relationship to that cultivar. Now on to the breeding of primocane fruiting in raspberry. First, we must talk about the growth style of red raspberries. Red raspberries normally have a biennial growth style, where each branch lasts 2 years. The first year only produces leaves and shoots. The second year produces fruit, following that the branch dies. Through crossbreeding with Siberian strains of red raspberry, new red raspberries that produce fruit on first year's growth, or a primocane, were produced. These cultivars were further improved through crossbreeding with other species of rubus, crossbreeding with Lloyd George, or crossbreeding with American red raspberry subspecies derived cultivars. Next, we'll talk about red raspberry cultivars for extreme climates. The red raspberry is not well suited to the southern parts of North America. To make warm climate cultivars, breeders crossbred red raspberry cultivars with other warm climate species. The species most commonly used were Rubus biflorus and Rubus critigifolus. The former was used to breed varieties that had traits identical to the northern cultivar, but had the heat tolerance of the southern cultivar. The latter species was used to add branch strength, disease and insect resistance, and early ripening traits to cultivars. In the land of snow and more snow, the country I call home, Canada, really cold hardy cultivars were needed for red raspberry production. So for breeding purposes, the most cold hardy of Russian cultivars and British cultivars were used, alongside wild raspberries found in Saskatchewan. Through that process, cold hardy red raspberries were bred in Canada. Now onto the breeding and domestication of black raspberry. The cultivars of black raspberry are selected seedlings of wild Rubus occidentalis. This species is not as cold-hardy as the red raspberry, resulting in this species not appearing very much in northern regions of North America. Active breeding of black raspberry began in 1893, and many cultivars have been produced since. The main goal in black raspberry breeding is the improvement in hardiness of the species. The main obstacle towards this goal is the lack of genetic diversity within the species. This is due to the fact that this species regularly self-pollinates, unlike the red raspberry. This created an almost entirely homozygous population. One researcher found it was nearly impossible to separate existing cultivars based on fruit and plant traits, and figured there would be no major improvements in fruit size, productivity, or disease resistance. But an advantage of this near homozygosity is the ability to incorporate traits via backcrossing. This brings us to the crossbreeding between species in an attempt to increase genetic diversity. The first attempt at crossbreeding was crossing a black raspberry with a blue raspberry. But the blue raspberry had undesirable traits, which included dull, soft fruits and small size. And these traits carried over into the progeny of that crossbreeding. There have also been crossbreeds with red raspberry, but resulted in mostly sterile hybrids. However, some were partially fertile and used in many backcrosses to increase genetic variation, although not all have been successful. One spin-off of this crossbreeding was the creation of the purple raspberry. These are produced through crossbreeding between black and red raspberries, but they have not been used in commercial production due to lack of popularity of the purple color. These cultivars have been mostly used for experimental purposes. One discovery through that process was that Lloyd George was a poor breeding parent for crossbreeding with black raspberries. Another discovery was that purple raspberries are more fertile with better quality fruit when they're turned into tetraploids. These new hybrids have been used for breeding black raspberries with red raspberry traits. Now onto blackberries. Next, you'll be talking about the Eubactis subgenus, which represents blackberries, and their domestication history, alongside their natural history. First, you'll talk about Rubus fruticosus. This species reproduces via apomixis, allowing the species to produce asexual seeds that are clones of their parent. This creates populations called microspecies that act as species but are not separate species. Due to the various levels of polyploidy, crossbreeding, and interspecies hybridization, figuring out the lineage of these microspecies is quite difficult. Other species used in blackberry breeding were the cutleaf blackberry, the Himalayan blackberry, and many other species. In North America, the early species were very few when it came to blackberry, but deforestation happened. This allowed extensive crossbreeding between the different species. This led to the creation of many new species. The species of blackberry found that seem to be primary species include the Allegheny blackberry, the sawtooth blackberry, the sand blackberry, Rubus setosus, and Rubus canadensis. The rest of the North American species seem to be formed from crossbreeding. The main blackberry species used for domestication in Europe is the cutleaf blackberry. This species may have an origin in a mutated form of another species like Rubus vulgaris or Rubus selmeri. This species was used to breed many blackberry cultivars such as Star, Wonder, and Dull Sweet. Another species used is the Himalayan blackberry. Despite its name, it's actually native to northern Iran. The famous breeder, Luther Burbank, bred and named the cultivar Himalaya giant due to its belief that the species came from the Asian mountains. Compared to the cutleaf blackberry, the Himalayan blackberry has a greater level of genetic variation, with different types of fruiting season, flavor, fruit size, and texture, and is capable of producing a high yield of fruit. Due to its poor firmness, however, this species is typically used for processing. The species of blackberry known as Rubus nitoides was chosen for breeding due to its flavor and its reproductive compatibility with another species that has spine-free variants. These new hybrids, however, were discontinued for domestication due to its late berry maturity and small fruit. But these hybrids remain the primary sources of the spineless trait in European blackberry breeding. In North America, the Allegheny blackberry was used in crossbreeding with other species to breed high-quality tetraploid cultivars. It was also used in breeding cold tolerance in blackberries. The sawtooth blackberry was also used in breeding cold-tolerant blackberries. Sam blackberry was crossbred with other blackberries in an attempt to increase the structural durability of the blackberry cultivars. It worked, but the berries ripened too late for them to be used, so they became defunct. The leafy-bract blackberry was used in crossbreeding to breed the variety Crandall. This hybrid was used extensively in breeding many different varieties of blackberry. The species Rubus robustus was used in breeding heat and drought-tolerant blackberries. The species Rubus baileiensis was used to breed cultivars that had high-quality fruit. One such cultivar made through crossbreeding that species with the sawtooth blackberry was called Austin maize. A mutated version of that plant called Austin thornless had the dominant trait for spinelessness. As such, this hybrid became the primary source for spineless blackberry traits in North America. Well, that concludes the talk on the Rubus species. Next we'll talk about the Ribus species. Until then, thank you for watching.